In our passage for today, we've got a story which in many ways makes for quite difficult reading. There's a woman who comes to Jesus seeking his help. Her daughter needs healing, so she's coming with a degree of anxiety, in considerable personal distress. And this lady is described as being a Greek. The importance of that is that in those days, being described as a Greek meant far more than just where the lady came from. It also indicated her religion by describing her as a Greek. It simply made it clear that she was a non-Jew. Jesus himself, of course, was a Jew. And the problem was that the Jews and the Greeks simply didn't get on. And this is uncomfortably demonstrated in the words that Jesus uses when she approaches him. He, if you like, reflects the animosity that existed between Jews and Greeks. When she comes to him, he simply answers her, "First, let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." Dogs. That's how the Jews of the day would have thought about and described the Greeks. Dogs. Now, people quite rightly point out that in the early New Testament texts, the word used for dogs means sort of small dogs. It indicates perhaps more of a domestic dog than a ferocious wild scavenger. But nevertheless, to describe somebody as a dog is derogatory. Jesus was reflecting, showing very clearly what the attitude of the Jew to the Greek was in those days. But if we look carefully at what he says, we see something very important. He said to this lady, "First, let the children eat all they want." First. What Jesus was doing, as well as indicating the divisions between Greeks and Jews, is that he was indicating his priorities. He was saying first. He wasn't shutting the door on this lady's request. He wasn't saying no, never. What he was doing is indicating, up until this point, he has had other priorities. And up until this point, those priorities had been, as we look through the gospel, to take the good news of his kingdom to the Jewish people. We saw that last week in the passage that we read, when he challenged the Jewish religious leaders. That's what he'd been doing. That was his priority. And that's what he wanted to continue doing first. But this lady's reply to that is brilliant. She says to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She was saying, but surely there has got to be something for me now. What we see is that Jesus saw this lady's sincerity, saw the bold step that she'd made in coming to him, appreciated her need, and he healed her daughter. This story is actually something that we, as a church, as followers of Jesus, can really learn a lot from. Jesus was willing to change his priorities. We know from as we look through the New Testament that the good news of Jesus was first for the Jews, but then was for all of humanity. We read in Acts how the good news starts in Jerusalem, very Jewish, and Judea, the Jewish area, out to Samaria, somewhat less Jewish, and then on to the rest of the world. That was the spread of the gospel of Jesus, of the good news. And that was the pattern that it was to follow. But what Jesus did at a time when his priority was to the Jew, his priority was to something else, is he set aside his priority for the person who was coming from a different position. Why do I say that's something we as a church can learn from? Well, all too often in history, people have been excluded from the gospel because of regional differences, cultural differences, religious backgrounds that were different. These things have stopped people talking together. They've stopped people working together. They've in history even led to wars. What this passage does is calls us to set aside all differences. Sometimes the gospel has been hindered by people who would be seeking, not really being accepted, welcomed, treated well by the church, simply because the church has had other priorities. What this passage does is calls us to question our priorities as Jesus questioned his, and to make space for those who are sincerely inquiring. Because what we see in this passage is that at all points, at all time, the good news of Jesus is for all.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life altogether wonderful to me.
In our passage, the story of the lady clearly demonstrates how regional, religious, cultural barriers are to be challenged and overcome for the sake of the gospel. In the second story in our passage, there's a man who's brought to Jesus who's deaf and cannot speak. For that man, there are physical barriers. For him, hearing and understanding the gospel. And what we see is that Jesus heals him in a very visual way. He uses his hands, he uses touch to communicate to the man what he's doing. It's another wonderful example of overcoming barriers so that the gospel can be known and can be encountered by all. This is a theme that I hope we're going to explore in our Zoom groups through the week. And I do hope that you're able to join us for one of those.